All right. Good evening, folks. There's a bunch of you pouring in here. We're gonna give it a couple minutes, let the vast majority of folks get in on the webinar, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Bronson to do the antler growth presentation here. So, Bronson, what's happening with deer down in your neck of the woods at this time of year? You starting to see some antlers sprouting?
Barely, yeah. It's they're just now beginning. And, it's still relatively cool. It'd be hot for you, but for us, it's still relatively cool. And so they're at the, kind of the bottom third of their antler cycle right now. And that'll go on for several more months.
Sweet. And so what are a couple projects that you and your students are working on in the midst of right now?
We are doing some prescribed fire work. So had a student literally just defend his thesis on Tuesday, looking at the timing of fire in terms of the season that it's in and the effect that it has on killing hardwood stems, which we typically want to get rid of, and promoting forbs. So to promote deer food, the optimal timing for that. And then we're always going through our buck movement data set and just asking new questions where we're looking at some of the trends in wind, how deer are navigating the landscape relative to the prevalent wind. So that's what I've been crunching numbers on here recently.
Very interesting. Yeah, I love myself and all the other 150 people in here love the data on buck movement. So with that, we're pushing, we're a little over 150 people in here. So for folks in here, your cameras are off. You guys are muted, so don't feel as though you're going to disrupt anything with things going on at home. If you want to just generally shoot in the wind with each other and talk about upcoming plans, what you're seeing for velvet in your neck of the woods, that type of thing, throw that stuff in the chat. And then if you have questions for Bronson regarding anything he's presenting on, please throw those in the Q&A. As myself and my coworker behind the scenes here will be taking note of all those different questions, and we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end to do that Q&A. So appreciate everyone coming out tonight. I know we're all going to learn a lot. So Bronson, from there, I'll kick it over to you. I think if you give just an introduction of who you are, what you do at the MSU Deer Lab down there, and then dive in. I know we're all looking forward to learning a bunch on velvet antler growth.
All right. Well, I just saw some questions pop up about where I'm located. Must be my accent. I'm located at Mississippi State University. So born and raised in Georgia, did several years grad school in Texas and South Texas, and I've been in Mississippi and Mississippi State now for over 20 years. So about half my life is here. I'm a researcher and outreach specialist for the MSU Deer Lab. So my colleague, Steve Damaris, we co-direct the MSU Deer Lab, and he is more of a leader on the research side of what we do, and I'm more of a leader on taking that research and developing outreach products from that. So, and one of the things that we produce is what I'm going to speak about tonight. So, Jared, I'm going to attempt to share my screen.
Yep, we got you. So if you go into presentation mode, we'll be right there with you.
All right, all good?
All good.
All right. Well, thanks everyone tuning in. Thanks for the opportunity. This is just a very general, for some of you, it may seem very specific, but in the world of deer management, buck management, antler growth, and all the topics we're going to review tonight, they could probably be a presentation in and of themselves. And some of these topics could certainly even be a course in college. So we're just going to kind of hit the high points here and hopefully in general cover the process of antler development and management of bucks. And so this is probably, if you're my age, you probably remember 30 plus years ago in hunting magazines and so forth, talking about the 3 things that affect antler development. And they were right 30 plus years ago, and it's still true today, and it always will be. These are the pillars and the foundation of antler development and really explain the variation that we see within a population and among populations. And that's age or buck age structure, the nutrition of the individual and the population, and then of course, genetics. And we're going to allocate time to each one of these categories here and talk about them. This is something that the National Deer Association produced many years ago. It's very informative. I see it all over the place. It's just a really good map demonstrating where Pope and Young's and Boone and Crockett bucks are harvested throughout the U.S. And we, of course, can see some trends here. Some of this is really obvious. But relative to those three pillars we talked about, age and nutrition and genetics, age and nutrition are playing a role in the patterns that you see on this map. Genetics, a lot of people are going to claim that certain areas of the country have, quote, better genetics. And I hope later in the presentation, I'm going to answer that and demonstrate that at least my opinion and that of the MSU Deer Lab is we do not think that is the case. So that is a view on a national scale, but then even within your region or within your state, there is also a lot of spatial variation that we see in antler size. And just in the state of Mississippi, if we go from one region, which we call the Delta region, dominated by agriculture, to the southern part of the state, the lower coastal plain and the coastal flatwoods, that is not dominated by agriculture and instead dominated by forest lands and forest industry lands, we see that there is, for mature bucks, an average difference of about 30 inches. And so this was really the goal, how many ever years ago, 15 plus years ago, for my PhD dissertation. This is what I examined. Primarily in Mississippi, but then also looking nationally, is what are the reasons that we see that can explain this spatial variation in antler size?
Hey, Bronson, I'm going to just, can you click full screen or presentation mode? Like we can see a small next slide option and a notes option. There's a couple people commenting that they'd like an increased size on what you're presenting.
All right, Jared, walk me through how to do that.
Well, you know what I'm looking at? I am not entirely sure. I would maybe try to exit out completely, and then typically F5 does presentation mode.
Okay.
Or if you go to view at the top there.
Okay.
And then, ooh, maybe not. Ooh, top left, there's that little next to, yeah, is that presentation mode? Yep, click on that. Interesting. Well, this is apparently presentation mode.
I
have
Ron,
that.
There's usually an easy option there to get you out of this so that you can still see what's coming up next, Bronson, but the audience can't. But the audience definitely can see your next slide.
Try display settings up on the top left there. I don't know. Give her a whirl. There we go.
There you go.
Is that it?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. All right. I'm going to.
Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you for correcting that. Okay, yeah, that was a good break anyway there. Okay, so for every one of these categories, I want to spend a little bit of time on this, and I call it the buck management continuum. And what it simply means is that there's a low-hanging fruit that most everyone, if you're interested in deer management and buck management, there are things that you can easily accomplish. There are things that a little effort is going to be needed. Sometimes a lot of effort is going to be needed, and it's going to be costly, either in terms of money or in terms of time. You're going to have to devote a lot of effort to that. And then we're going to wrap up with things and activities I read and hear about all the time that I believe are virtually impossible, meaning you are wasting your time and money. So I'm going to add that at the end of every section and provide some comments about that. Number one, lowest hanging fruit. easiest, cheapest, and most important. And this may seem so pedestrian to everyone, and I understand, but the bottom line is big bucks, trophy bucks, etc., they're old bucks. And so this is just something that we always have to think about. NDA has done a wonderful job putting out educational material about aging bucks on the hoof. That is a skill you have got to perfect if you're really going to take your buck management to the next level, learning how to age bucks on the hoof. Age, the effective age, is also interacts to some degree with nutrition. And what I mean by that, in areas that have better nutrition, you will reach that maximum antler growth a little bit sooner than you will in places that are historically identified as having less or poorer nutrition. Some examples in Mississippi in our agricultural region, essentially at 4.5 years of age, this is probably true for the Midwest as well, you're kind of at that point of diminishing returns in our ag region. But if you go down to our coastal area where nutrition is more limited, this is also could be very similar to South Texas. Managers and biologists there are always seeking to get deer to 6, 7, and 8 versus say 4 or 5 in some regions. So age is important, but that magic age of where you've hit diminishing returns and antler size is maximized is going to vary probably from 4 to 6, depending on where you're at in the country. Here's a little game I like to play, and hopefully it'll sink in and demonstrate a concept. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in reverse here. And so what I have on the left here are the antler score, Boone and Crockett score of mature bucks. And what I want you to do, I'm going to give you a second to think about it, is for every one of those categories, what would they have been if they had followed a normal growth trajectory at 3.5 years of age? So our 140 class buck, which would be a really nice buck in the deep South, only scores a little over 110 at 3.5. 150, so in a lot of the eastern US, a 150 is a great buck. What does he score at 3.5? About 120. And how about if you're in South Texas, you're in the Midwest, and you're going for 160s, 170s, 180s and above, what did those bucks score at 3.5? Approaching 130 inches. So the point I'm trying to make here is that these trophy bucks, these big bucks, they're not born big. They have to be allowed to get older. And what we have seen time and time and time again, properties, hunting clubs, etc., that are having issues getting those bucks into that 150, 160 or greater category are doing a poor job of managing the harvest of bucks at 3 years of age. So they're harvesting the bucks that show the greatest promise to be a 150, 160 or 170, but they're getting harvested too early. Very, very important concept to implement. Also, the effective age is non-typical characteristics. So you can see this example is one of our captive bucks from years ago. Basically a typical frame, but you see starting at 4 years of age, you start to see stickers. And at 5 years of age, you start to see more stickers and longer stickers. So another benefit, along with increasing the general antler size and the frame of maturity, are those character points that we all like, the drops, the splits, the stickers. We usually don't see that until 4, 5, or 6 years of age. So age structure, again, easiest, cheapest, most everyone, if everyone is on the same page about what their goals are for managing the buck population, most people can get this done, easy and cheap. Nutrition, we put this in the second category, second easiest, second most important. Deer eat a lot of food every single day, and I think people underestimate how much they eat and the influence of nutrition on their body size, their health, and their antler size. The graph you see on the right, that was a study conducted in Texas by Donnie Harmel years ago, well in the 1970s, and just demonstrated a 20-inch increase in a population of bucks that had a 16% protein diet versus an 8% protein diet. And protein gets a lot of the attention, rightfully so. Protein is needed for tissue building. It is needed for antler growth. It is needed for lactation, growing those fawns. So the magic number there that we strive for is we want the minimum diet quality to be 16 or greater % nutrition. But there's a lot of other things too. Nutritional requirements for deer. Energy, something we don't think about that often. 100-pound deer is going to need right at 2,000 calories a day. And that's not to grow antlers, and that's not to grow fawns. That is not for a lactating doe. That is a deer sitting in a barn or sitting in a crate just for baseline metabolism and thermoregulation. So energy in their diet is important. Vitamins, just like with humans, they need all these things, A, D, E, K. Some of these are fat soluble. What that means is they can store those vitamins. They're stored in the fat, mobilized and used when needed. Others, B, C, folic acid, niacin, etc., are water soluble. That is important to note because that has to come from the diet, and it needs to come every 3, 4, or 5 days. So it's just not going to be maintained in their body unless they're taking those vitamins in through their diet. Macro minerals, the ones we hear about the most, again, rightfully so, calcium, phosphorus, building bones, growing antlers, potassium, iron, manganese, sodium, micro minerals, iodine, copper, zinc, all these have been shown through research to be needed by deer. And then, of course, water, of course. And a deer is going to need about, it's going to vary by region, it's going to vary by how much water content is in the forage that they eat. But in general, about a gallon for every 100 pounds of deer, you need about a gallon of water. Now, on the human side of it, how do we get all this? Well, nutrition experts with USDA and other places, they give us a food pyramid. And they basically say 2 or 3 servings of that, 2 or 3 servings of this, et cetera, et cetera. If you eat these foods in these quantities, you're going to get what you need. How do we do that for deer? Well, in my opinion, and I think it's very, very safe to say this, all you need to do is to provide an abundance and diversity of naturally occurring plants. These are the plants that you see here, at least in the southeastern US. These are the plants deer evolved to eat. They've been eating this stuff for thousands and thousands of years. And so if there is a diversity of plants out there, deer know. The term is called nutritional wisdom. They know when they have a deficiency in their body of a vitamin, of a mineral, and they know the plants that they can consume to satisfy that deficiency. So the simplest thing you can do if you're trying to increase nutrition for your deer is have a bunch of plants and a diversity of plants. And you're going to be okay in terms of addressing all those nutritional needs. People also underestimate how much deer eat in a day. Steve and I made this video, heck, over 5 years ago, I guess, and we got a lot of positive feedback on this, but we went through and looked at, what is 4 to 5 pounds of deer forage, of those deer plants they're going to eat all the time, dried them to get their weight. And then we went out to, I don't know, somewhere like Walmart and bought these synthetics that is of the same weight, composition, size, weight of what these deer plants would do. And what Steve has on the table there is just an example of the amount of forage a single buck would eat in one day. So think about that. A single buck, the amount he eats in one day. Now that buck is going to eat over a ton of forage over the year. So I want you to think about your landscape that you're hunting and managing. Are you providing that amount of forage? Now, If you're in the Midwest or in our ag region in Mississippi, you probably are, and it's probably being done via agriculture. You know, soybeans do a great job of filling up at least half of a deer's rumen every single day. But what if you're in a region that's dominated by the panel you see in the middle, industrial forest? How much forage are you going to be providing on the landscape? Well, it's going to depend on what proportion of your property is that middle panel. If it's a lot of your property, then you likely are going to have a nutritional limitation. But if you have forest land that's managed like the panel on the right, again, we're back to where an abundance of food and a diversity of food, we're going to check all the boxes and address everything a deer is going to need. Let's look at some individual impacts here. So just to show you, just using protein here, here's a captive buck at the MSU Deer Lab Harry Jacobson had years ago called Boss. And this is what he looked like at 9.5 years of age on a low protein diet. Of course, his antlers are small, and you can tell by his body too, he's not in good condition. Now that same buck, a year older at 10.5, fed a high protein diet. Look at the change in his body shape and look at the change in his antlers. Now, I know he doesn't have the prettiest set of antlers, but if you just look at the amount of antler growth when he had protein in his diet, look at how well he was able to perform. Here's another comparison. Showed you this bar chart a little bit earlier, but I'm just highlighting two regions, our Delta region, our ag region, and our lower coastal plain. I call that our forest part of the state region. And there's a difference at 3 years of age. There's a difference in antler size of 25%. So a 25-inch difference or 25%. What can we do? Now, a lot of people in my state and in the South think that there is a genetic problem. There's a genetic limitation in that part of the state. Well, we took that to task, and this is a really complicated analysis, and I'm just going to take you to the punchline here real quick. But we conducted a study where we collected deer, wild free-ranging does, in fact, from these two regions, and we brought them back to our facility, and then we isolated their diet. We gave them the exact same diet where they had everything they need. Well, the offspring, which we allowed to grow to the bucks to grow to 3 years of age, we were underwhelmed. We really didn't see that big of a change. None in the Delta region, and down in the lower coastal plain, a modest, a few inches increase there. But then we looked at the second generation. Now, why is the second generation important? It's because the first generation was born of wild mothers. The wild mothers experienced the nutritional conditions they lived in. So the offspring of wild does. Now, the second generation is offspring of the first generation, which had plenty of food and high quality nutrition. And that's where the magic happened. So in that lower coastal plain, then we saw an average increase of 28 inches or a 27% increase that now equals the antler size of those bucks in the Delta. So there was no population level genetic problem at all. It was all an issue of limited nutrition. Long-term impact of nutrition. Animal diet is important. And what I mean by that is the example I gave you of Boss, that buck. What he eats in his life from year to year is important, but also what his mother ate and what his grandmother ate. Their maternal nutritional condition also affects genetic expression. And that term for that is epigenetics. So intergenerational nutrition is your goal. And the results, the best results, are seen in decades, not years. And I know that can be discouraging. We all want to see a big difference next year or 2 years from now. And you will see, as you saw from our studies, you're going to see an increase year by year. But the biggest gains are in that second and third generation on good nutrition. And that largely, from that map I showed you at the beginning, that's really the reason for this regions of the country having greater trophy potential. So on our buck management continuum, improving nutrition and habitat management, it requires some effort. Absolutely, no doubt about it. And also it can be costly. And mainly the cost is going to come from effort. So if it's you and a drip torch, you and a chainsaw, you and your food plots, etc., not as bad. If you have to pay for a lot of that, then yeah, it can get costly. But as you know, it's something that we love to do and something that's going to yield a big impact for you. Okay, genetics. Look at this. Now, based on the audience, some of you may look at that and think it's beautiful. I think it's amazing, is my perspective. I think it's amazing of the genetic potential for antler growth in whitetail deer. Do I personally, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, do I think that represents what I want in a deer, in a wild deer? That's not for me, but it may be for some other people. But the point here is, can individual deer and populations of deer be influenced by genetic manipulation? The answer is absolutely yes, they can. I'm going to give you a moment here, starting with the bottom left photo, to guess the age of each of these bucks. So the buck in the bottom left, how old do you think that buck is? He's 2.5. How about the buck in the center? That's just a little old yearling. And how about this gargantuan buck on the right? Surely that is a mature buck. Another 2-year-old. So to say that genetics are not important is wrong, but it is misguided in how we use it. Notice in the background, notice the fence. So these herds are manipulated and totally controlled who is breeding who. This is something we can't do in the wild. So can we incorporate selective harvest to, quote, improve genetics? Examples are, you hear them all the time, we're going to shoot spikes to improve genetics. We're going to shoot those 8-pointers, get them out of the gene pool. We're going to shoot those lopsided bucks, et cetera, on and on. Can we really do that? Well, here's an example from a colleague, Mitch Lockwood. He did this in Texas years ago, and this was a captive deer herd with controlled breeding. And I keep talking about controlled breeding because that is what is so important. You have to determine and dictate who breeds who. For this experiment, 8 years of selection, breeding the best bucks to the best does, and they increased the antler points of yearlings in that short time frame from 4 to 7. So they almost doubled antler points and an 80% increase in yearling Boone and Crockett score. So can you do this in controlled breeding? Can you manipulate genetics? Yes, you can. So this is an example I like to use. Hopefully it'll resonate with some of you. Rolling the dice. And so let's take a set of dice and let's roll them 1,000 times against the wall. If you did that, you're going to see a probability distribution like you see in the table here, and you see on the right-hand side with the graph. Getting a value of 2 when you roll the dice is very, very rare, only about 3%. Getting a value of 12 is also very, very rare, about 3%. You keep getting these values of 6 and 7 and 8 because there are different combinations of numbers on the die that will give you that result. So a 6 can be a 5 and a 1, a 4 and a 2, a 3 and a 3, etc. So when you roll those dice, those are the most frequent outcomes. Now I want you to think one of those die is the mother, is the doe. One of those die is the father, is the buck. And so random breeding over and over again, we see the same type of distribution in the antler size of offspring reflected with Boone and Crockett score. There's a mean right in the middle of about 130 inches or so. And those bucks that score 160, 170, et cetera, and larger, they're very, very rare. How do deer breeders do that? They do it because they can manipulate the dice. Their set of dice only has 5s and 6s. That's how they can always roll 11s and 12s. We can't do that with a free-ranging population. To demonstrate this, we conducted a study using, and this study was to mimic hunter harvest, so buck or male selection only. And we worked with livestock geneticists. So these are geneticists that work at a corporate scale, managing livestock genetics and figuring out who needs to breed who and so forth. So using wild deer rather than cattle and using genetics simulation models, we input all the values that hunters are going to face and the environment that deer live in from year to year. And we ran these models for 20 years. So we're mimicking, if we started a selective harvest program, what is the result going to be 20 years from now? And when we ran these models, we found out that we could only increase antler points by, I'll let you guess for a second, we only increased antler points by 1/10 of an inch, and the best case scenario was 9/10 of an antler point. So we did not even increase the average number of antler points for mature bucks by 1 point. Why? What went wrong? Well, it has a lot to do with that woman you see there on the right, that beautiful doe. How in the world can you select the best female? Remember, the female, the doe, she's one of the die. She has 50% of the genetics that is going into that offspring. You have no idea when you pull the trigger, is her offspring, her son's going to be above average, average, or below average. All bucks breed, even yearling bucks, even in populations where buck age structure is optimal. There are always going to be opportunities for even yearling bucks and 2.5-year-old bucks to breed. And also what I mean there is there's also opportunity for bucks that have above average antlers, and below average antlers to breed. So we have just the opposite of the scenario from the controlled breeding, because this trophy sire buck is not the one doing all the breeding. All bucks are breeding. We also have buck breeding value. In a deer pen, in a deer breeding scenario, they know the pedigree of that buck. They know the breeding value that he is going to produce on the average above average offspring. His sons are going to have really large antlers. We have no idea. Even if you see a 160 on your property, you have absolutely no guarantee that his sons are going to have big antlers. The environment, year to year, things like drought, things like mast crop, having it or not, flooding, severe, severe winter. It goes on and on. Those things affect antlers, and what you are choosing to make that harvest decision is based on an environmental factor at that point, not a genetic factor. And lastly, dispersal. So those buck fawns that grow into yearlings, they are dispersing at 1.5 years, 1 mile, 5 miles, 10 miles away. So this genetic package that you're striving to produce in terms of buck fawns for your property, they're dispersing off your property, and your neighbors' yearling bucks are coming to your property. When you put all that together, I mean, it is just a leaky bucket. And by leaky bucket, I mean a whole bunch of leaks. There's just no way you can contain genetics and manipulate genetics in a free-range herd. So, are genetics important to individual bucks? Yes. Yes, they are. The genetics for an individual is the blueprint for that individual. When he acquires the food that he needs, the water, et cetera, and grows, he is going to build the blueprint that is in his genome. Are genetics important to populations? No. No, they're not. Individuals, but not populations. Therefore, can you manage for genetics? No, you can't. Not in a free-ranging population. Conversely, can you remove those bad genetics from the population? And again, you just can't do it. Too many leaky holes in the bucket. So managing for genetics is only effective in deer pens. And I actually changed the slide. I had in here originally managing for genetics only effective in captive populations. It's not even that. You can't even do it if you had a 1,000-acre, 3,000, whatever high fence where the herd is, quote, captive. You still can't do the level of manipulation that would be needed to produce what you're seeing on the slide. It has to be in a deer pen, a breeding pen, where you get to control who breeds who. So on our buck management continuum, here's where we are with managing for genetics. I would say it is virtually impossible for you to make any progress, any tangible progress at all, and it's going to result in a waste of time and a waste of effort and money in that pursuit. Okay, buck management. What are some stats for managing a buck population? And here, I just want you to get a feel for someone that a deer biologist is going to be looking at to kind of understand the numbers and understand how you make harvest decisions. What bucks you choose to shoot and when you harvest them is going to have a big impact on your success. So we got to talk about a statistical distribution. It's called the normal curve. It's also called the bell-shaped curve. This is very, very common in biology. So we'll use the height of men in the US as an example. And essentially what that is the top of the curve here. Go over here to the left-hand side, percent of the population. This just means the height of this curve, it is more frequent, it is more common. And so there are many more of these individuals versus what is at the tails of the distribution, the bottom of the bell. And so with men in the US, we see that there are very, very few men that are 6'8" or above. Also, there's very, very few men that are 4'8". And we have, examples of that everybody's probably seen and aware of. Danny DeVito. We don't see a whole bunch of Danny DeVitos walking around. Similarly, we don't see a bunch of Shaquille O'Neals and Kobe Bryants walking around either. Those phenotypes for height are very, very rare. They're out there, they're genetically controlled, but the average you see for height is about 5'10", 5'9", 6 foot, etc. That is where most people lie on that distribution. The exact same thing, the exact same phenomenon occurs for white-tailed deer and mule deer and elk, et cetera, all deer, same phenomenon. And what it is we have an average, the meat of the curve. For example, mature bucks in Mississippi, that average is mid to high 120s. That's the average mature buck in Mississippi. We have very few of those 150, 160, 170s. We also have very few of those bucks that are going to score less than 80 inches. So keep in mind, all bucks, even if you're doing everything right, you're managing age structure, you're managing nutrition, you're doing everything right, all bucks aren't big. There's always going to be the statistical distribution is always going to be at play. So what you have to do is think about, how do we apply this? How do we use it and make sure we're harvesting the right bucks? This distribution, much like throughout all the US, it's influenced by nutrition. So the bell-shaped curve is always there. It's just where the peak of that distribution is influenced by nutrition. So the peak of that distribution in Mississippi in the Delta region is about mid 130s, 136. If we go down to the lower coastal plain, it's going to be right below 120 inches. So the same frequency distribution, the behavior of the distribution is the same. You're just shifting the meat of the curve to the right as you increase nutrition. So put another way here, on the left, there's fewer really small bucks. The average is in the middle, fewer really big bucks. Now I'm going to walk you through the effect of age. The slide before, you saw how the curve changed with nutrition. Now I'm going to show you how the curve changes with age. So here's 3.5, Just kind of note where the peak is at: 3.5, 4.5, 5.5. I'll do that again: 3.5, 4.5, 5.5. So within the 3.5-year age class, notice you got some superstars. There's not many of them, but you've got at 3.5, you've got some that score in the 130s and some that score in the 140s. Those are the bucks that have to be protected. Those are the ones that are going to be the 160s and 170s at maturity. So you always have to be thinking, you're always pairing the age of the buck on the hoof, and antler size to make your harvest decision. How about prediction? Can we use a young buck's antler size to predict what he's going to be at maturity? In other words, what's the likelihood? Is the fella on the left, is he going to go and look like the buck up top or the buck at the bottom, below average? It's really, really difficult. And I would say it is really inefficient. The younger the buck is, the more opportunity you're going to have to make an error. There is a relationship, but it's unreliable. And that's mainly due to the environment. Younger bucks are very sensitive to environmental events. That can be a drought during the summer when the buck is in gestation. It could be the first year he hits the ground. It can be harsh or prolonged winters, especially up north. In the south, in my neck of the woods, flooding, the impacts flooding are going to have. And these effects, believe it or not, when they occur, when the buck is in utero or that first year of life, you can see the legacy or the signal of a severe environmental event for up to 2 years. So here's one way I like to explain it: predicting mature buck antler size at 1, 2, and 3 years of age. The bullseye on the left, some of your shots are on the paper. You got a bunch of flyers. It's just, you don't have it sighted in very well. At 2 years of age, you're getting all your shots are on paper. They're all on the bullseye. And by 3 years of age, now you have a really reliable depiction of what that buck is going to be at 4 and 5 and 6. So it's just very difficult to tell what the destiny of that buck is going to be in terms of his antler size when he's 1 year of age and also 2 years of age. Okay, shift gears a little bit here to antler anatomy and some abnormal antlers. So this is a term that sticks in every deer biologist's craw all the time, and I hear it, so does Kip and others, is antlers are not horns. So we hear, buck had big horns, or look at his horns. And I know we're nerds about it, so forgive us, but antlers aren't horns. Antlers are grown and shed annually. Horns are not. Antlers grow from the tip and not at the base. Antlers are the fastest growing true bone in nature. So we can't find anything that grows as fast as antlers, really unique. And then they're covered with velvet during that period of growth. Kind of looking at their anatomy here and the anatomy of an antler, it starts with the pedicle. And so think of the pedicle as the foundation. That's the foundation of the house, and everything is going to grow from that. The interior of the antler is spongy bone, and the exterior of the antler is going to be the compact bone, the really hard bone. And remember, it is growing from the tip. So the tip, the growing tissue, is most sensitive. And so we have the growing tissue. Next, it's going to form cartilage, then mineralized cartilage, and then bone formation. So that is what's happening at the base of the antler when the antler is grown, and it moves outward. Here's another depiction of an actual antler. You can see the growing tissue on the right-hand side. Lots of blood was in there, and then you can see the more mineralized part and the spongy bone and the compact bone on the image on the left. What causes all of these abnormal antlers that we see? And that's a really bad case there. A lot of it is going to be injury. It could be injury to the antler while it's growing. It can also be injury to the pedicle itself, affecting the foundation. And sometimes in some places, this can be complicated by a particular bacteria that's going to affect the growth. And then even injuries to the body are going to affect antlers. So trauma to the antler, the extent of it, of the damage, is going to depend on when and where the trauma occurs. So we have an example like this where the growing tip of the antler, and probably in these two cases when the antler was just beginning, the beam was just beginning, damage on the end of the growing tip could cause it to fork, could cause you to have two main beams and a lot of other, different configurations. And here's an example where it was the growing tip, but it was the growing tip of the tines, in this case, the G2 and the G3. So those were damaged and it never fully formed on that left side. But again, that was damage at the growing part of the antler. Here we have it where it's a little bit later. So this buck, mineralization was already occurring. And so a break, trauma happened and it broke that antler. Now it didn't break off, still vascularized, and minerals, blood supply, etc., could get to the tip of the beam, but the spongy, bony part was broken in two. And so on the left, you see what he looks like in velvet, and on the right is what that antler looked like in hard antler. Here's another example. This one is from South Texas, but you see in 2011, this buck, beautiful mainframe 10. And then you see 1 year later, 2012, the G2 was broken. So it was formed. Of course, he hadn't shed his velvet yet, but there was enough of that spongy, bony material where the break or where the trauma occurred. And then the next year, he grew completely out of it. So trauma to the antler, not the pedicle, but trauma to the antler, they're always going to grow out of that the following year. Okay, now is where we get the long-term consequences. Some people call them the asymmetrical antlers or the spike on a side, lots of different names for it. But typically this is happening when we have damage to the pedicle itself. So we have affected the foundation for antler growth and it's never going to recover. So these are some examples that you can see on the left-hand side. We call that kind of some superfluous antler growth there. Notice the shape of that antler is very different because of the pedicle damage. The one in the middle too, notice the shape of that is different. The one on the right, therefore, it was causing some abnormal shedding. So parts of the pedicle itself was coming off in the shedding process, and that is never good. This literally is a buck I harvested many years ago, and I've seen this buck, and we had him on camera for several years. And he was a spike or a fork on one side. This buck was, when I harvested him, he was 6.5 years old. And you can just see up close the difference in the position, the size, and the shape of the pedicle on the left versus the normal pedicle on the right. So trauma of some variety, who knows, happened years ago. The buck still grows an antler, but it's never going to be the same and shaped the same. Other examples here, this is just some things that cause, the shedding, and when the shedding abnormally and taking pieces of the pedicle with it, more than likely that is going to influence the pedicle and the antler the following year. Other examples here, literally parts of the cranium coming off, that is likely going to lead to a brain abscess and probably kill the buck. This is an example of a brain abscess. That just simply means that bacteria has gotten into the wound. And when bacteria gets into the cranium, in the skull, and then starts getting into the brain itself, it is usually going to mean the demise of the buck. So on the left there, you can see the pus where there is active infection. And on the right, when that skull was cleaned up, you can see that the cranium was all pitted. And that is where that bacteria had invaded and the infection had invaded the skull cavity. There are some other cases too that are the best evidence suggests that we have a legacy of a particular type of bacteria that can be correlated back to the restocking efforts. So the example you see here is from in Georgia, and places that were restocked from Texas and places that were restocked from Wisconsin, we see a much higher frequency of these asymmetrical antlers and how it affect the pedicle in those areas that were restocked in Wisconsin. So lots of different interactions going on here, but very interesting. Okay, testosterone and the antler cycle. The antler cycle is governed by testosterone, and the testosterone cycle is also influenced by photoperiod. But the bottom line relative to antlers is that after the breeding season, after the rut, and then when the buck is in a hard antler, testosterone levels are going to drop. And then they finally reach some tipping point, some low level, and it's going to initiate casting of the antler. Testosterone levels remain low, usually for spring and sometimes on into the summer, and that is where you start getting your antler growth. So the antler growth, the buck is in velvet, antlers are growing and growing every single day. By late summer, that is when testosterone levels triggered by photoperiod, testosterone levels begin to rise. And the first thing that happens is then active mineralization of the antler all of the way through. So now we're getting to hardened antler. And then once we're at hardened antler, that is when we have velvet shedding. So when a buck is in hardened antler, that is an indicator that he is also capable of breeding. So bucks are capable of breeding generally the entire time they're in hard antler. Then they're just waiting on females to come into rut during their very short period of time when they can take advantage of it. Here's some anomalies. This one is called a cryptorchid buck, but a lot of these cactus bucks, cryptorchids, even hermaphrodites, etc. But usually when you see these bucks that are perpetually in velvet, it means that they had a disruption in their testosterone cycle. So it could literally be trauma. The testicle could be damaged and therefore it's not producing as much testosterone. But the 3 arrows you see there represent 3 years of antler growth on that buck. And so it never reaches enough testosterone. Testosterone's remaining low. It never reaches that tipping point, that level to where antlers are mineralized, hardened out, and velvet shedding occurs. And then we have the body injuries. And this is just really fascinating. And most people are familiar with this. Contralateral asymmetry. And what that essentially means is when a deer is injured, his back leg or the back part of his body is injured, it's typically going to influence the opposite antler. And not a drastic difference, the example you see on the right, but his back leg, his right leg was injured and it caused the left antler to be deformed. Now this switches when we get about at the shoulders. We see that it switches and goes back to the injury on that particular side is influencing the antler on that side. So this buck, his right antler, what you can see is malformed, and also he had an injury to his right shoulder. The thing about this, you might say, well, what's the big deal if his bones are injured? How is that affecting antlers? You got to remember that bucks are going through seasonal osteoporosis. We talked about antlers being the fastest growing, bone tissue. They literally cannot eat enough food to supply enough minerals to synthesize those antlers in real time. So they're getting the minerals from their diet. Simultaneously, they are mobilizing, borrowing for some point of time, minerals and resources from their long bones. And then after they're in hard antler, those minerals can be replenished back into their bones. So when you see a big bone injury into a long bone, that's kind of the reason it's going to affect antler growth. Okay, our conclusions, our take homes. Control the things that you can control, and that's not genetics. Buck age structure. Remember, simplest, easiest. If you can do nothing else but only harvest mature bucks, you're going to be very, very satisfied with the result. Young bucks with antler growth potential, those bucks have to be protected. They are a priority. They are an investment in your management program. Nutrition. Get good nutrition on your property however you can. Habitat management combined with food plots is just a really, really good recipe for success. And unfortunately, there's no shortcuts. There's no way around this. There's no diet pill. There's nothing where you can get these types of results overnight. It takes a lot of work and a lot of time. Resources for you. NDA has a wonderful, wonderful aging guide that you can get from them. Go to their website, deerassociation.com. I know so many hunting camps in the Southeast have this poster on the wall, and it's very, very good. We have a mobile app called the Deer Aging app, and it will just kind of help you. So maybe if you're in the field or you have more inexperienced hunters in the field, ask them to download this app, and you can get it off our MSU Deer Lab website, and free to download, free to use. If you enjoyed this content, or maybe you want a different topic, highly encourage you to attend the NDA Steward online. That course is amazing. Over 20 individual topics, 6 sessions, 8 speakers. And again, you can do this at your own pace. So go online and check that out. Buck management, some of the stuff we talked about today, another presentation on buck management, on forest management, habitat management, herd management, and very, very important, hunter management. Making sure you're getting everybody on the same page here of your management objectives. And then some really, really cool biology, deer diseases, deer movements, and home range use. So highly encourage NDA's Deer Steward course. The stuff I talked about buck management too, we have a book on this, Steve Damaris and I, and you can get this as an ebook or print, whichever you prefer, but you can go to Amazon and get that. It's called Strategic Harvest System. And so we've got literally 125 pages of text and graphs and charts to kind of guide you through managing a buck population. We also have, Steve and I, our deer workshops that we did for years and years. We have a lot of that content online now. We developed that during COVID when we couldn't give the workshops anymore. And if you go to the bottom right, those QR codes there, your phone, you can scan those and it'll take you somewhere to show you how to register for those and watch those if you're interested. More info about the MSU Deer Lab. We're on all the major platforms, Facebook. We have a YouTube channel, Instagram, etc. We have a podcast called Deer University. And so if you like to hear a couple of deer nerds talk about bucks and antlers and mortality and stuff like that, I encourage you to listen to that. And then other topics. Deer University is part of a network, a podcast network called the Natural Resource University Network. And we have podcasts focused on just habitat, prescribed fire, fish management, pond management, etc. Working wild lands, dealing with people, timber, and our latest one is wild turkey science. So if you go to the address there below, you can find all of those. And Jared, that is all I have. If we have time for questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Awesome. Bronson, you can stop your share now. That was a fantastic presentation. I mean, I learned a ton, and I know a bunch of the other 200 and some folks that were in here did as well. Our buddies at NDA have agreed to give away a seat to the Deer Steward 1 course. So we just dropped the giveaway link in the chat. That is only going to be available for you folks still tuned in to this webinar. So make sure that you hit that link that is in the chat. We'll dump it in there a couple more times. You only have like the next 12 hours to fill out that giveaway link. So please do so in order to get entered to win. I am currently going through Deer Steward 1, and the amount of information in there is fairly ridiculous, to be honest with you. I've had to watch and rewatch multiple sections, and I want to say there's like 17 total hours of material in there. So if you're serious about whitetail hunting, particularly if you have a property of your own that you manage, it is insanely useful and beneficial. You honestly absolutely crushed that, seeing as a lot of the questions that were coming in, you subsequently answered. I did see one that I really liked in there. The myth is still alive. Will a spike remain a spike for his entire life?
I hate saying this. I really do. And folks that listen to our podcast know what I'm about to say. It depends. So what I mean by that, can you find in the world of whitetail deer, can you find an example where a yearling buck spike remained a spike to maturity? Yes, that has happened. But 99.99999% of the time, no. It's just a young buck. That's all it is. Most of your spikes, we have an example here from the MSU deer pens where a spike turned into a 180-inch buck at maturity.
Yep, love it. Does antler growth timing maintain relatively the same timeline across the country? As in, are deer growing antlers in Mississippi at the same time that they're growing them in the UP of Michigan?
Yeah, roughly the same. So, I mean, you've got to pair it with, you got a short period of time on the ecological biological clock. You got to pair antler growth with spring green up and summer. And then they've got to be finished and hardened antler by the time fall rolls around and of course, by the breeding season. So, yeah, I mean, everywhere it's a spring summer phenomenon.
What is the highest protein food source that I can be planting or supplemental feeding with, in order to get these deer that protein in the crunch time of, June, July, early August?
From a, say, food plot perspective, soybean, alfalfa are really, really high. But don't neglect things like clover. I mean, clover can get 30% crude protein during certain times of the year. So, and a lot of people don't believe this, but we collect the data and look at it. A lot of the weeds that a lot of people think are no good, they can be over 20% crude protein during the spring. So it's just a winning combination to manage your habitat and then pair it, supplement with food plots. You'll get your nutrition.
And Kip, I think you're still in here if I'm not wrong, but I do believe that the Deer Steward course touches on a lot of those food sources that have that high crude protein, and you can get a ton of information on what you can do to manage for those types of plants and really identify them, because that's the hardest part about plants is knowing what you're looking at.
That's for sure. Yes, and those are included. And great presentation, Bronson. And for everybody here who enjoyed seeing what Bronson did tonight, he gives other talks in Deer Steward 1 as well. So he listed, there's 8 different instructors. Bronson is one of those, and he has multiple talks in that. So if you liked hearing what he had to say here, he has some other really cool talks in there as well.
Why, Bronson, why do bucks lick and often sometimes eat the hanging velvet as they're shedding?
I don't think anyone knows for certain, but it is probably Mother Nature's way of recapturing nutrients. And so I'm sure it is a nutrient dense tissue, and they get some phosphorus, some protein, some calcium, whatever. So it's low hanging fruit.
And do you have any counterparts in the scientific world that are studying deer, in the Midwest, or, even in regions that are between the Deep South and the Midwest? Obviously, the Mississippi State Deer Lab is, what many consider the leading deer research in the world. So do you have any counterparts in your circles that are doing research on Midwestern deer?
Yeah, you can look. I can't say they maybe do as much as us, but there's a lot of deer research comes out of Michigan State, University of Wisconsin, Iowa State, Nebraska. I have a colleague at Kansas State University that's doing some deer research. So yeah, just contact your state land grant university and see what they're doing.
Awesome. All right, last one, because it was fascinating and I didn't even know it was asking until you brought it up. Do you have anything more to talk about the role of epigenetics in antler growth?
Well, I have a presentation that is about the same length here, where I fully go through that process, where I go through that experiment and what epigenetics are and so forth. We also talk about it in the book that I mentioned. We talk about those results there. So we have podcasts. If they go to Deer University and look through the titles, we talk about their epigenetics there as well.
Awesome. Well, Bronson, can't thank you enough for the time and knowledge that you have so generously shared with us. As mentioned, if you're looking for ways to connect with Bronson, his podcast out of the Mississippi State University, as well as that book that he, showed in those last slides. This webinar has been recorded and it will be put on the onX Hunt YouTube channel tomorrow. So if you want to scrub through, relearn some of that stuff, check out the book, all those links, all that stuff will be available on the onX Hunt YouTube channel by tomorrow. So Bronson, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight to learn alongside with us.
Thank you, Jared. Appreciate the opportunity.
Have a great week, everyone.
All right.